Hola, ¿qué tal? In this video we are going to revise Unit 7, La Inmigración. As you already know, in these revision videos we don't just look at the topic itself, we also revise the grammar and the vocabulary that go with it. So when it comes to the topic, we're going to look at the origin, distribution and integration of immigrants in Spain, how hard life is for undocumented immigrants and the difficulties they face, and finally what's going on with immigration in Mexico. From a grammar point of view, we'll revise the conditional tense and conditional sentences, gerunds and above all the uses, and relative pronouns. And finally, as usual, I'll give you some tips about vocabulary. Alright then, let's warm up with some grammar. The conditional is used to talk about what would happen. For example, I would travel, could you help me? He said he would come. The good news is that it's super easy to format. The starting point is the infinitive, and then you just add the endings as usual. And here comes the best part. There is only one set of endings for the three groups of verbs. Some examples: emigraría, creceríamos, me movería, reflexive, deberíais, viajarían. But don't claim victory just yet. Remember the irregular verbs. Tener would be tendría, venir, vendrías, poner o decir diría, haber, habría. Yeah, I know. Now let's move on to conditional sentences. Remember that a conditional sentence has two parts: the condition and the event that happens or doesn't happen. For example, if it rains, we will stay at home, or if you do the job, they will pay you, or if I had money, I would go to Tenerife. En español, si llueve, nos quedaremos en casa. Si haces el trabajo, te pagarán. Si tuviera dinero, iría a Tenerife. So, having said that, we have three types of conditional sentences. First conditional is used for real possible situations, things that can really happen. The structure is if, present tense, and the second clause in future. For example, if deportations continue, the country will face a crisis. The second conditional is for real or improbable situations in the present or future. The structure in English, not in Spanish yet, is if, past tense, and the second clause in conditional. If deportations continued, the country would face a crisis. And finally, third conditional. This one is used for impossible situations, events that didn't happen in the past and therefore don't exist in the present. The structure in English is if, had, and past participle, of course, and the second clause would be would have and the past participle. If deportations had continued, the country would have faced a crisis. Now let's see the Spanish translations. For first conditionals, the structure is si, present tense, and the second clause is in future tense. For example, si las deportaciones siguen, el país enfrentará una crisis. The second condition is si plus imperfect subjunctive, and the second clause in conditional. Si las deportaciones siguieran, el país enfrentaría una crisis. And here's a very common mistake. It seems that the conditional tense comes right after si, but it doesn't. Just like in English, after si, if, comes the past tense. In Spanish, the past tense is the imperfect subjunctive, and then the second clause is in the conditional tense. Finally, the third conditional. Si, pluperfect subjunctive, and the second clause is in the conditional compuesto. Si las deportaciones hubieran seguido, el país habría enfrentado una crisis. It sounds complicated, but it really isn't, because if you think about it, it's just always hubiera and correct past participle, and habría and the correct past participle. To finish with conditionals, I need to remind you of one very important thing. Conditional sentences work both ways, and see if can come after the event that happens or doesn't happen. If you want to learn more about conditionals, I'll leave a link to a more detailed video. Okay, now let's talk about gerunds. What is a gerund? Well, basically, it's the ing form of a verb used to talk about an action in progress. In Spanish, we form it with the verb estar followed by the verb in gerund, ando for ayer verbs and yendo for ir and ayer verbs. Let's see some examples. Estamos apoyando la inmigración. Estáis abandonando vuestro país. Están discriminando a los latinos. Estoy ayudando a una ONG. Estás sufriendo discriminación. And está huyendo de la guerra. Okay, now the uses, which is more complicated. So in Spanish, we use gerund when we are using progressive tenses, ing, of course, when saying by doing, but without by, and after the verbs continuar and seguir. And we use infinitive instead when the action is the subject of a sentence. After preposition, I remind you that in English, after preposition, we use in English always ing, gerund, and after all the verbs except the verbs continuar and seguir. Let's see some examples. For progressive tenses, estamos hablando sobre la inmigración, o el gobierno ayudará construyendo nuevos albergues, no por o para construyendo, just construyendo. Los inmigrantes africanos continúan llegando. Now action, emigrar no es fácil, to immigrate, no immigrating. Canarias es conocida por acoger inmigrantes. And finally, el gobierno evita hablar de este tema. After the verb evitar in English, avoid is ing, in Spanish is infinitive. And be very careful when translating. We don't use the gerund to talk about future actions because for a Spaniard, the gerund is always an action in progress, not something that is going to happen. For example, if you literally say, estamos yendo a México mañana, it sounds weird and you probably won't be understood. So how do we translate it? You can use the normal present tense or the structure we are going to, vamos a. For example, vamos a ir a México mañana o vamos a México mañana. Great. Now let's move on to relative pronouns. Relative pronouns connect extra information to a noun. So what are the relative pronouns? The king of relative pronouns, the most important one, is que. It means who, that, or which, and it works for people and things. For example, las personas que llegan al país buscan mejores oportunidades, o las leyes que regulan la inmigración son complejas. If you're not sure with which pronouns to use, que is usually correct. Quién and quiénes are only for people. They usually appear after commas or after prepositions. For example, los inmigrantes quienes trabajan duro ayudan a la economía, o la mujer a quien entrevistaron contó su historia. When you use a preposition and que sounds unclear, use el que, la que, los que, las que. It works for people and things. Las políticas sobre, preposition, las que debatimos afectan a los inmigrantes. Los centros en preposition, los que viven muchos inmigrantes están llenos. Similarly, you can use but this is very formal. El programa de visas, el cual empezó este año, tiene muchos requisitos o las reformas, las cuales propuso el gobierno, cambiaron el sistema. Now, one students always hate, cuyo. It means whose, and it agrees with the thing owned, not the person. For example, conocí a un hombre cuya familia, notice that cuya agrees in gender and number with familia, emigró por necesidad, o es una comunidad cuyos miembros apoyan a los recién llegados. Use ¿dónde? For places. This is easy. La frontera donde llegan miles de personas necesita más ayuda. O el barrio donde viven muchos inmigrantes es muy diverso. Finally, lo cual means which when it refers to an entire idea or situation, not just one noun. It's neutral, so it never changes form. Muchos inmigrantes se enfrentan discriminación, lo cual dificulta su integración. O no todos entienden lo que significa dejar su país por necesidad. If you want to know more about relative pronouns, you'll find a link below. Now, it's time for us to immerse ourselves in the topic. Now it's time for the topics. As I mentioned earlier, we will look at the origin, distribution and integration of immigration in Spain, how hard the journey and life of undocumented immigrants are, and what is happening with Mexican immigration. Origin first. But before that, very quickly, let's look at the background, because for centuries Spain was more a country of emigration than immigration. In 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of Spaniards emigrated to Latin America, Argentina, Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, and to Europe in search of work. But starting in the 80s, Spain changed from being a country of emigration to a country of immigration due to democratization after 1975, joining the European Union 1986, and rapid economic growth and demand for labor in agriculture, construction and services. Main groups arriving during this time was the Moroccans, the closest and most traditional group, Latin Americans, easier integration thanks to shared language and culture, Eastern Europeans after the fall of the Soviet bloc, and more recent arrivals, often irregularly sub-Saharan Africans. The 2008 economic crisis slowed immigration and caused some immigrants to return home. Although since 2015, with economic recovery and global migration crisis, new flows have arrived. And today? Well, the five main immigrant communities in Spain today are Moroccans, people from Hispanic countries, from Romania, and in recent years, immigrants from United Kingdom and Italy. Let's break these groups down in numbers. The population in Spain is in 2026 is around 49 million and almost 500,000 and is expected to continue growing. Approximately 40.1% of the population are legal immigrants. The most numerous group is Hispanic Americans, almost 2 million. In second place, Moroccans, with almost 970,000 people. Next, Romanians, around 609,000, then Italians, around 345,000, and finally British, 266,000. Now that we know who the main immigrant groups are, let's talk about where they actually live in Spain, because they are not spread out evenly. They live in Madrid, Cataluña, la Comunidad Valenciana, Murcia, Almería, Málaga, las Islas Baleares y las Islas Canarias. Madrid is the place where the largest number of immigrants in the country. You'll find people from very diverse regions here, especially Latin Americans, Eastern Europeans, and Africans. Catalonia has the second largest immigrant population in Spain. Here, the main groups are Moroccans, Latin Americans, and Romanians. Next up, the Valencian community is extremely diverse. You will find a lot of British immigrants and Latin Americans here. Murcia and Almeria, these areas are very high immigrant ratio, especially Moroccans and Latin Americans. Moving south to Andalusia attracts many, again, Moroccans and sub-Saharan Africans, mainly for agricultural work. At the same time, there are many British immigrants living in coastal resorts. In fact, Málaga is the Andalusian province that attracts the largest migrant population, especially along the Costa del Sol. And finally, the islands. In the Balearic Islands, you'll find many British people, Italians, and Latin Americans. Meanwhile, the Canary Islands receive more Africans and Latin Americans. So now that we know where immigrants live, let's look at how well different groups integrate into Spanish society and which groups tend to face more difficulties. Let's go group by group. Latin Americans first. When it comes to language and culture, integration is usually much easier. They already share the Spanish language and many cultural references with Spain. Socially, they generally integrate quite well into the community, although they can still face stereotypes based on nationality, especially when it comes to lower skill jobs. In terms of education, their children usually adapt very quickly to the school system because of the share of the language. And for employment, many work in hospitality, domestic services, and commerce. Some manage to achieve job stability and even start small businesses. Moroccans. So regarding language and culture, Arabic and Berber are predominant, although many do learn Spanish over time. The Muslim religion can also be a differentiating cultural factor. Social integration is often slower, mainly because of cultural and religious difference. However, the second generation usually adapts much better. One of the main challenges they face is discrimination and stereotypes, which can make integration more difficult. In terms of employment, many work in construction, agriculture, and services, although some experience job insecurity. For Romanians, language can be an initial barrier, but cultural and European proximity helps a lot. Socially, they tend to integrate gradually, and once again, the second generations that goes through the Spanish school system adapts very well. When it comes to employment, many work in construction, agriculture, and services, and some go on to start their own businesses. Now, Italians are very culturally close to Spain, which makes integration much easier. Many already speak Spanish or learn it very quickly. Unfair. Social integration very good, as they share many cultural, gastronomic, and family values with the Spaniards. In terms of employment, they often work in tourism or hospitality or their own businesses. They usually have stable jobs. And finally, let's talk about British immigrants. In terms of language and culture, many do not learn Spanish, which creates a much bigger language barrier. Because of this, many live in areas with a high concentration of foreigners and often don't move beyond those communities. Socially, they tend to form closed communities in certain regions, which limits their integration into everyday Spanish life. In education, British children often attend international schools, which reduces contact with Spanish students. And in terms of employment, many are retired or work in tourism and real estate, jobs where learning Spanish isn't strictly necessary. Now let's move on to a much more difficult reality: the life and challenges of undocumented immigrants. Undocumented African immigrants are forced to leave their countries because of war, poverty, and political instability. Many of them cross the Sahara Desert into North Africa and then risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean Sea into Europe. Along the way, they face violence, trafficking, hunger, and detention, yet they continue with strength and determination in search of safety and dignity. Let's look at where they usually come from and the main routes they take. Let's start with the Atlantic route. From West Africa to the Canary Islands. These are long and extremely dangerous crossing, departing from countries like Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Guinea, and also from Morocco and Western Sahara. This route has seen the highest number of arrivals to the Canary Islands in recent years, and it's also one of the deadliest at the sea. Next, the Western Mediterranean route. Alboran Sea and the Strait of Gibraltar. These are shorter but very frequent crossings between northern Morocco and sometimes Algeria and Tunisia, and Andalusia, especially Almeria, Malaga, and Cadiz. This route is commonly used by small boats and fast craft. And finally, Ceuta and Melilla. Crossing to Spain's North African enclaves, Ceuta and Melilla include attempts to cross border fences or to reach the enclaves from the Moroccan coast in very small boats. There are also overland movements through Moroccan and Algerian territory that end at these entry points. These locations combine land border crossings with the sea arrivals. Now we are going to explore one of the most important migration stories in modern history, the evolution of Mexican immigration to the United States. Over just a few decades, this migration flow transformed communities, labor markets, and demographics on both sides of the border. We're going to look at the three key phases: the dramatic expansion, the peak and slowdown, and finally the recent period of stabilization and decline. So let's begin. From 1970 to 2000 is a period of major expansion of immigration. In 1970, there were fewer than 1 million Mexican-born immigrants living in the United States. By 2000, this number had risen to around almost 10 million. This was the period of fastest expansion of Mexican migration. It was driven by strong labor demand in the US, especially in agriculture, construction, and manufacturing, by demographic pressures in Mexico, and relatively accessible migration channels in previous decades. Mexicans became one of the largest foreign-born groups in the United States. From 2000 to 2010, continued growth at the beginning of the decade, followed by a sharp slowdown. Between 2000 and 2007, the number of Mexican-born residents in the US rose to about 12.5 million, reaching its historical peak. From 2007 onwards, flows declined due to the economic recession in the US, stricter border enforcement, higher migration costs, and improving economic conditions in Mexico. Between 2005 and 2010, the number of Mexicans entering in the US was roughly equal to the number leaving or returning to Mexico. After 2010, Mexican migration established and in some years even declined. But what is happening right now in 2026? Many Mexican migrants have chosen to return voluntarily, not because they wish to, but because of constant fear of raids, retention, and separation from their families. At the end of 2025, around 200,000 migrants left the United States, organizing a trip called Regreso Seguro. These caravans aim to offer safety, often through coordinated transport and support, helping people navigate difficult routes or border areas. But the reality is that for those returning, Mexico is often no longer home. Many struggle with unemployment, trauma, and the pain of a family separation. In response, the Mexican government launched México Te Abraza, a program offering food, shelter, medical care, documents, and short-term financial support to returnees at the border. While the program provides immediate relief, long-term reintegration remains a challenge. Behind the statistics are thousands of lives forced to start again, caught between borders, uncertainty, and loss. No need to say anything else. Let's move on to the vocabulary. We are about to finish. To finish off, as usual, I show you the essential vocabulary for this topic. These are the minimum you should know, but remember, the more you learn, the better. Anyway, I'd like to comment on a few really important vocabulary points you should definitely remember for this topic. First of all, hospitality in Spanish is la hostelería. However, you can also say la industria hotelera, and both are perfectly correct. But this last one is in more formal context. Another key word for this topic is la patera, which refers to those small boats often used by undocumented migrants to cross the sea. Okay, now I'm going to repeat this slowly, especially for those in the back. Apoyar means to support. Soportar means to bear, to tolerate, or to put up with someone or something. They are not the same, and confusing them is a very common mistake, so be very careful. And be careful as well with the spelling when conjugating huir, to flee. The E, when conjugated, the I, changes to Y, so pay close attention to that when you write it, okay? And absolutely some useful adjectives you should highlight for this topic are penoso, abarrotado, or amenazador. And important expressions, sin papeles, o flujo migratorio, o libre circulación. And that's all, ladies and gentlemen, about la inmigración, a key topic where language and real life issues come together. If this video helped you, click like and subscribe for more A-Level Spanish revision. Nos vemos en el próximo video. Gracias. Hasta luego.